Oh boy.
When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
Piece we're going to talk about is going to be the solo piano work, Moment Musicaux number 6. So I think the first thing I want to do is just take time to listen to it while the score displays. It's a long work to listen to. It's about 8.5 minutes, but I'm going to play it and I'll have the score there for you to see. Something you should know though is that there are a couple times when the score is not going to do the page turn with you. For instance, when Schubert repeats from the second page back to measure 17 on the first page, that page turn won't happen. And then after the trio is over, it will go back to the beginning of the piece for the DC, but it won't show the ending of the piece, which you have already had access to when you did the homework. But I want you to be able to hear the piece all the way through if you haven't already, so you can hear its form and think about sort of what is the form of this piece. It's got two big sections, the allegretto, which is basically the first page and the top of the second page, and then the trio, which is the last part of the second page. So think about both the form of the allegretto section and the trio section individually, and then think about what happens when those two are combined into one piece. So have a listen. I'll see y'all in 8.5 minutes. really useful and instructive, and maybe even a little bit forward-looking. And it sounds like Schubert, and it's very melodic and pretty sounding, but it also has a little bit of a hint of what Ravel's music can sound like sometimes. But let's talk about what's going on in the Allegretto, which is the most challenging section of this composition. And it's a very easy chordal texture. You know, there aren't a lot of melodic runs or anything to deal with in this piece. It's very, very harmony oriented. But figuring out what Schubert's doing with his chords is tricky. But it's, of course, the thing you want to know if you're analyzing the piece, because part of what makes this such a good piece is there's just so many good sounding chords. And when you look at his first little gesture there, you realize these chords aren't as tricky as some of the ones in the Chopin pieces we looked at. There aren't a lot of non-chord tones, and it's fairly easy to put a label on each chord. And the chords that you're looking at now, those are some chords that a person wouldn't necessarily be faulted too poorly for identifying. You know, that all makes sense. You look at the first chord, it's A flat and C and E flat, and that's a one chord in the key of A flat. That second chord, the one that's the dotted half note, D flat, F, A flat, C, wouldn't think too hard about that. That's a D flat major 7 chord. Let's call it 4/7 in the key of A flat major, right? So all these chords, you can identify them pretty easily. But there's labeling the chord, and then there's like getting through to the actual sense of the chords and how they connect to the chords before them and after them, and whether or not these chord progressions make great sense in the key we're in. And with this one, you find something that's a little troublesome. In fact, I've got two of the chords labeled kind of funny. They're not labeled in just plain old red the way the others are. They're in italics and weird lettering, and that's because I think those two chords are not necessarily what they seem on first brush. You know, the 4/7 chord, that certainly looks like a D flat major 7 chord, but I think there's something going on with it where we'll realize that may not be what we're actually dealing with there. And likewise, the other chord there, the one that really should start you thinking about this, is that circled chord. The F minor chord with C in the bass, which is a second inversion triad, which in the key of A flat would be a 6/6/4 chord. Now, the deal is, though, of course, the thing we've said about 6/4 chords before is that when composers write them, they usually write second inversion triads as primary triads. You know, technically you're only supposed to have a 1/6/4 or a 4/6/4 or a 5/6/4. 6/6/4 is really not on the menu. So we need to figure out what's going on with those chords. And we'll come back to it in a minute, but it might be that we'll have a better sense of what's going on in this piece with those chords if we work a little bit further forward first. Analysis doesn't have to be don't go forward until you figured out what happened before. You can have some things that are question marks, and you're going to work forward, and then you'll come back and see if you can make sense out of them. And this business with the 6/6/4 chord is certainly one of those times where I think it would be good to say, let's look a little bit further on and see if we can figure out what Schubert's doing. Because Schubert's going to show us something in a second that'll give us a hint about how we might approach that 6/6/4 chord in a more sensible way. It's really not that challenging either. It's got a secondary dominant in it, a 5/5 chord going on near the end of the line there. But it's basically all about dominant and tonic harmony in the key of A flat major. But the chord at the forte piano mark there that I've labeled 5 like there are no problems, of course you all might look at it and be like, no, there's a big problem with that. A 5 chord in the key of A flat major is E flat and G and B flat. And I can see the E flats and B flats in the bass clef there, but if you look above the forte piano mark, instead of seeing G's, you see a lot of gibberish. You see a D natural and an A flat, and that's not really what's in a 5 chord. The 5 chord doesn't seem to be happening until the quarter note in the next measure. There's where I see E flat, G, B. So what's the deal with the D's and the A flats? Those are non-chord tones. Left over from the chord before, which was B flat, D, F, A flat. So he holds on to the Ds and the A flats from the chord before, but he goes to the E flat underneath, and then he takes the Ds and the A flats and he resolves them by step. So what he's doing is he's writing non-chord tones. He's writing suspensions. A suspension's a non-chord tone that's held over from the chord before it and resolved down a step. And that's what those A flats are. And he's also writing upside down suspensions, what are better known as retardations. And that's what happens when a tone's held over from the chord before and then resolved up by step. So when he writes that 5-7 of 5 chord there, or that 5-4-3 of 5 chord, and he goes to the 5 chord, he's got those leftover notes that he's got to move up to. So here's the 5-4-3 of 5 again. And you can hear both those things needing to happen. There's that D natural in the outer voice that really wants to go up. That's the retardation. But there's also that A flat in the inner voice that equally wants to move down. Put them together. And they form this sort of double non-chord tone business, a retardation from D up to E. That's what the 7-8 numbers are showing there, and a suspension from A flat down to G. That's what the 4-3 numbers are showing there. And more importantly, this lets us know something about the piece, which is that suspensions are very important to this piece. I'm always telling people suspensions are my favorite non-chord tones. And they seem to be most composers' favorite non-chord tones, because as much as students may not like to analyze them or think about them, all those dead guys who wrote all the pretty music we have really like to write them. So you need to be on the lookout for suspensions a lot of the time, because they're out there more often than we might want to think about it, making music sound awesome. And this is one of those pieces that is really, among other things, a love letter to the suspension. So once we get to that forte piano mark in measure 7 there or whatever, and we realize, suspensions are a big part in this piece, they're going to be an important ingredient, that might be when we start looking back with our analyzing and asking ourselves, were there maybe other suspensions that happened? And if so, might they affect the Roman numerals we're looking at? Might we have actually overlooked some suspensions? And I would say the answer is yes. And when we go back and fix it, our Roman numerals are going to look a little bit tidier. And we won't have those suspicious chords, like the 6-6-4 chord especially, to deal with anymore. We're going to find a better explanation. And that better explanation is going to be, it's not a 6-6-4 chord. It's a chord with a suspension. As I said, that chord in measure 3 with the F sharp, with the F and the A flat and the C on the bottom, rather than calling it 6-6-4, let's view that F as being suspended from the chord before it, right? F was on top of that 7 diminished 4-3 chord, or 7 half diminished 4-3 chord. Basically, Schubert just held on to that F, and then he went to the A flat chord, the A flat C E flat chord with C in the bass. But instead of going straight to the E, he left that F lingering a little bit further there. So we've got our chord. That F is being suspended, and then it's going to the 1 chord. Because if you think about it, a 7 half diminished 7 chord usually leads to a 1 chord. It's dominant functioning. When I play this chord in the key of A flat, it wants to go here to 1. And that's where Chopin goes. He just holds that F for a little bit longer. Before doing that. Just like before he went to the 5 chord at the end of the line there. he held the D and the A flat as retardations and suspensions. And I would say that if we decide that there's a suspension in measure 3 on the 1-6-4 chord, if you think he's suspending the F there, then we might decide that the chord in the first full measure, the first dotted half note, instead of calling it 4-7, D or D flat F, A flat C, we might decide that that C is being suspended and that the chord is really just 2-6-5, like it shows up being on the quarter note there. Because here's the 1 chord, and then we're going to suspend the C and move it down to the B flat right there. So really, even though it sounds like a D flat major 7 chord, what Schubert's actually trying to do is just get from the 1 chord to the 2-6-5 chord there. But it's a little bit more exciting and a little bit more pretty sounding to have that suspension. So let's think about suspensions, and let's realize that this is a piece of music that's going to have a lot of them, because when we go into the second system, we're going to see suspensions are part of the game there as well. Sort of takes the first 8 measures and reinterprets them and takes them to a slightly different place, but it starts off exactly the same as the very beginning. When we're moving to from the first system to the second system, we do the 1 and then the 2-6-5 chord or the suspension. And then we have this augmented 6th chord, right? D flat and B natural form an augmented 6th interval. It's a French augmented 6th chord from the key of F minor. And that next chord is going to become a C major chord. And the C major chord is best thought of as the 5 of 6, the 5 of F minor in the key of A flat major. So what's really happening there is that D flat B G F chord is a French 6 chord in the key of F minor, going to a 5 chord with a suspension that becomes 5. Yeah, I mean, the sound you want to hear next is that, right? An F minor. That's not what Schubert does, but that's what he sets up. And then he sort of tells us no, just kidding. We're going back into A flat major after all. But with more suspensions and retardations at the ending there, because when it gets to the 1 chord, there's leftover stuff from the 5-7 chord that has to be resolved. The B flat up top is a suspension that needs to go down to the A flat. The G in the second highest note in that measure needs to go up to that same A flat, and that D flat needs to go down by step to the C. And when it all happens, you get that really nice sounding 5-7-1 with the triple suspension retardations. So suspensions are the key to understanding how a lot of this piece works, because they are very, very important. Numbers in our Roman numerals, like figured bass to show the suspensions. There's what that would look like when you actually put in the numbers. And again, they're describing things that happen above the bass note, A flat. The 9 to 8 is describing the B flat, which is a 9th above the A flat, that moves down to the A flat, which is an octave above the A flat. The 4 to 3, or well, the 7 to 8, let's do that next, is describing the G that moves up to an A flat an octave above that A flat bass note. And the 4-3 is describing that D flat above the A flat bass note, a 4th that moves down a step to the C, which is a 3rd above the bass note. And again, here it is coming from the 5-7 chord. Creates that really, really lovely dissonance that then resolves by step into that one chord at the very, very last bar there. Small musical unit, which is part of form. You know, a lot of times we get to saying something is a ternary form or a variation form or whatever by looking at smaller things, like how the phrases go together. And remember, phrases sometimes go together and form things like periods and phrase groups and stuff like that. So that's what's happening in these opening 16 measures. They're forming something that makes its own little small formal unit. So to figure out formal units like that, you have to know cadences. In fact, you know, if you know cadences, you will be able to do form and analysis. There's really no way to do it without being able to analyze cadences in tonal music. So we're looking for cadences in these opening 16 measures. I think there are two places where everybody would agree there has to be a cadence. There's a cadence on an E-flat chord in measure 8, and there's a cadence on that A-flat chord in measure 16. And if you're in the key of A-flat major, then a cadence on an E-flat chord is a half cadence, and a cadence on from an E-flat chord to a 1 chord is an authentic cadence. In this case, a perfect authentic cadence because the melody ends on A-flat, on tonic. So those are two cadences that I think you have to agree are there. So if you think this is two 8-measure phrases, one ending in a half cadence and one ending in a perfect authentic cadence, then you'd probably say this is a period. And we'd say it's a parallel period, by which we mean the first phrase and the second phrase begin in the same way, right? They both begin with the little, with all that stuff. Now they go different places from there, but they both begin the same way. So the fact that the two phrases begin the same mean this is a parallel period. But you may be sitting there thinking, I don't think this is two 8-measure phrases. I think there are more phrases. I think these are 4 4-measure phrases. And you can do that as long as you can find a cadence in each measure. That's a little tricky here. You have to modulate. But that 7 diminished 4 3 to 1 in the first phrase, that's a type of authentic cadence because, right, 7 diminished to 1 is similar in function to 5 to 1. So it's an authentic cadence as well, an imperfect authentic cadence. And down there where that augmented 6th chord is, that creates a half cadence in the key of C minor. Doesn't that sound like a 5 chord that wants to go to a 1 chord? It does to me. So you could get 4 phrases, in which case instead of looking at one 2-measure parallel period, we're looking at something different. We're actually looking at a period that has 4 phrases involved in it. And it's what we call a double period, which is where those first 2 phrases, the imperfect authentic cadence and the half cadence in the top line, they form the first part of the period, what we call the antecedent portion. And then those last 2 phrases, the half cadence and the perfect authentic cadence in measure 16, they form what we call the consequent portion. It doesn't really matter whether you think there are 4 phrases or 2 phrases there. Either way, you're going to think these first 16 measures make some sort of a period. But if you think there are 4 phrases, you need to call it a double period. If you think there are 2 phrases, you need to call it a parallel period where each phrase is 8 measures long. All right, let's keep on going across that double bar because this is where things start getting scarier. Pianissimo mark there. That's when the piece starts looking very scary. I mean, I hope you noticed in hearing the recording that all that stuff actually sounded fine. Didn't really sound any worse than the stuff in the first part. But in terms of just chords that have a lot of accidentals and make us think, this looks kind of treacherous. And then he does that whole thing with changing the key signature, which is just like really bad news. But we're going to make sense of all these things. So let's see what we can do here. So, you know, that very, very first chord with the F flats and the C flats, it sounds like a major minor 7th chord. If you don't really hear any other chords around it, You might be thinking, I bet that thing's going to do this. That thing doesn't do that, though. Instead, it does something very different. And it's spelled in such a way to let us know it's going to do something very different. It's not spelled like a major minor seventh chord. It's spelled differently. You know, if it was a major minor seventh chord and F flat was the root, then it wouldn't have a D natural and it would have an E double flat. But Chopin spells things right. He's got the right notes there. What's going on is this is a German augmented sixth chord, which is the augmented sixth chord that sounds exactly like a major minor seventh chord. But it behaves different. Instead of doing what a major minor seventh chord would doing and sounding like this, it does what an augmented sixth chord would do, and it doesn't go to tonic. It goes to dominance harmony in the form of 1-6-4. Which makes sense in the context of the piece. One thing about augmented sixth chords that's worth remembering too, augmented sixth chords give people fits because they don't behave like the other chords, like the triads and the seventh chords. With most chords, we try to look at them and figure out what note could be the root, and then we stack the other notes on it, like the third and the fifth and the seventh, and it makes sense. You can't do that with an augmented sixth chord. Even if it looks like it'll stack up root, third, fifth, seventh, there's going to be something in it that doesn't work. And I'll show you how that works here. With this particular chord, maybe a lot of y'all, when you looked at it, saw, oh, there's an F flat and an A flat and a C flat and a D, and gosh, how could I do this? Oh, I could stack it root, third, fifth, seventh if the D was on the bottom. And yeah, you can get a nice chord built of thirds, D, F flat, A flat, C flat. But the problem is it won't really make any sense. It's not any type of a triad or seventh chord. And the clue is this. It's that D natural to that F flat. When you go to look through the chord and figure out what it is and think about what type of third is it, you're going to realize D natural and F flat's not a major third or a minor third. And all of our triads and seventh chords use major and minor thirds. But when you've got D natural and F flat, you get a diminished third. This is something to file away and know. Whenever you get a diminished third in your chord when you stack it up, chances are it could be an augmented sixth chord. Because what happens to the interval of diminished third when you invert it? Diminished inverts to augmented, 3 inverts to sixth. Augmented sixth chord. So that's an augmented sixth chord from the key of A flat, major, or minor. And remember that when augmented sixth chords, they have two notes that are a half step away from the dominant. The dominant in A flat is E flat. So you've got the F flat, which is your bass note, which is a half step above the dominant E flat. And the other thing you've got at the same time is you've got the D natural, which is a half step below the dominant E flat. Put them both on at the same time, and they resolve out by half steps to the interval of an octave, which is what a lot of augmented sixth intervals do. So this little phrase starts off with an augmented sixth chord, and basically what Schubert does is he sort of just changes our key from the A flat major of the first 16 measures to the parallel key of A flat minor. That's really what it sounds like we're hearing there, and all those chords make really good sense if you analyze them in A flat minor. Most of the notes are from the A flat minor scale. C flat and F flat are going to be part of that scale with no trouble. And you can see that there's a nice little half cadence in the middle of the bottom line there where the 1-6-4 goes to the 5. And then he picks up again, starts it out like he started out at the pianissimo mark in the second line, but it leads somewhere different. It leads to a new key, a key of 4 sharps, which a lot of us like to think of as the key of E major. That's what it looks like. That's how he writes it. What's really happening is this. When you're in the key of A flat major, this chord sounds like flat 6. It's an F major chord. A borrowed chord. So F flat major is a normal chord in the key of A flat major. You can borrow it, and it's a totally normal chord in the key of A flat minor. It's the 6th chord. What's going on with the E flat major key change is this. Chopin is actually moving to what sounds like the key of F flat major. When I hear this piece, that's what I think has happened. He's modulated to 6. He's modulated to the key of F flat. If you've ever thought about writing in the key of F flat major, you realize that's awful. We don't have a key signature for that even. So what Chopin's doing is he's working in harmonically. E major equals F flat major on the piano. So he's writing it in a way that looks good. But, you know, if he'd actually notated it the way it functions, the way it sounds in F flat major, you'd have like centuries worth of piano players going crazy, pulling their hair out, going, I can't do that. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, you know, why didn't he just, you know, if he was going to be in E major, why didn't he write the first part in G sharp major? Same drill. Think about what the key signature for G sharp major looks like. We don't have that. So this is what he has to do to make the piece easy on the eyes, because it's already easy on the ears the way it sounds. It's just a matter of notating it in a way that performers won't find alienating. So when we go to E flat major, he's really thinking of that as F flat major. He just knows better than to try that kind of silliness on it. So let's keep going. Right, in the key of F flat major, that A flat minor triad at the end of the first line, last measure, it can be a first inversion 1 chord in A flat major. It can be a first inversion 3 chord in F flat major. And that's sort of our pivot chord. And then he just slides into the enharmonic version of F flat, E major in the next line. And things are actually kind of easy, right? We've just got some pedal tone activity, a dominant pedal for the first 4 measures, and then a tonic pedal for the last half of the second system. And things sort of work in E major from there. And we get to see one of those common tone diminished 7th chords again as well. That's what happens after the triplet there, where we've got the little right, that A sharp diminished 7 chord over the E pedal tone is a common tone diminished 7 that resolves to our E major chord there. And the common tone is the E natural. That stays in the same voice. So rather than trying to put a Roman numeral on that diminished 7th chord, let's just call it CT diminished 7 and be done with it. And things work out nicely from there. And after that little slip into E major / F flat major, he slips just as handily right back out of it and goes back to A flat major by the end of this page. And you can see that his gateway chord in the A flat major is the chord that ends the E flat major section, the 1 chord that we have there. That 1 chord also sounds like F flat or flat 6 in the key of A flat major. And he starts writing it like F flat major when he goes back to A flat. That sounds just like the E chord I just heard. And there it is being an augmented 6th chord again with a suspension. Because remember, these suspensions are going to be important things. They're going to keep going and going and going throughout this piece. But he brings us back to A flat major to end this first section of the piece, the section we call the allegretto. That he wants to write at the end of the line there and stuff, where he goes from that 5 to the 1 chord with all those suspension notes and an appoggiatura over that. but he's ultimately heading us back to the key of A flat major. Well, we're already in the key of A flat major. He's ultimately bringing us back to the opening materials. We're right after the pianissimo mark in that line. He's going to go back to that opening idea that begins the piece, that sort of is the most memorable melodic hook in this allegretto section. But when he goes back to that opening part of the allegretto section, it's different. You know, one question we could ask about the allegretto is, what is the form of just the allegretto? And we're going to get a couple of different answers, neither one of which is really comfortable. One of them would be rounded binary. And you might say it's rounded binary because we had the 16 measures before the double bar. Then we went through all that business in F flat major and back to A flat major. And now with that little return to, we're back to the opening material, to the part we'd call A prime. But it's going to be different than at the beginning. That's why we're calling it A prime. The problem with calling it rounded binary is I would then say, yeah, so what about modulating in the A section? When did that happen? It didn't, did it? Yeah, it stayed in the same key. That's more of a ternary thing. So if you think it's ternary, you're still going to say that the A is the first 16 measures and the B is at the double bar. Then you're going to say that this part where we go back to the little gesture is the return of the A. Ternary is an explanation that we could use also, but the problem is the last A is really different than the first A. And also, did the B section really contrast all that much? Maybe just being in the key of F flat major was enough to create contrast. But either way, you know, this isn't a perfect fits like a glove rounded binary or ternary, but that is the form of this allegretto, is some version of ABA, either ABA ternary or ABA prime rounded binary. And you know, I guess your job as an analyzer would be to figure out which one you could defend best. But let's look at how this ends, because it ends kind of scary too, but scary cool, so let's talk about that. Differently here. One of them is right after the forte mark, where he changes that opening thing that's usually very rooted to A major, A flat major. Now he puts some F flats in, and he makes it a little bit darker, makes it have some A flat minor notes in it. See how that F flat really makes that chord a little bit more sad, and he puts a passing tone in before the B flat that resolves our suspension there. So that's one thing he does to change up. And then he brings back the key change again. He's writing in 4 sharps, but he's not really in E major or F flat major. Everything sounds like it's in A flat to the ending here, even with the 4 sharps key signature. What's he doing? Why is he writing with 4 sharps? It's because of what's happening there. He's tonicizing an A major chord with that little passage that starts at the fortissimo. Every chord there is either an E7 chord, which is 5/7 of A, or it's an A major chord. So, you know, as far as what's happening, that's A's dominant 7th chord, and when it goes to that A chord with C sharp in the bass, that's where we expect it to go. But when that passage ends, it still sounds like it's in A flat minor. That sounds like a 5 chord in A flat minor. If I did this next, that would be fine. So Schubert is tonicizing A major with the fortissimo stuff. But we're in A flat major. What the heck does an A flat major chord have to say to an A major chord and vice versa? How do we get an A major chord in the key of A flat major? Here's the trick. Think inharmonically. Don't think of it as A major. Think of it as being in the key of A flat major, and instead of calling that chord A major, we're going to call it B double flat major. And that would mean we'd be talking about a major chord built on the lowered second note of our A-flat major scale. We'd be talking about a Neapolitan chord. And what Chopin is doing in that passage is he is tonicizing the Neapolitan chord. So that chord with the D in the bass and the E major chord above it, that's 5-4-2 of the Neapolitan. And it goes to the Neapolitan, and then it goes back to the 5-4-3 of the Neapolitan. Then it goes to a root position Neapolitan at the beginning of the second line there. And then it goes right back up to the first inversion Neapolitan. And remember, Neapolitan chords are usually predominant. So look at where that Neapolitan at the end of the first measure in the second line goes. It goes to 1-6-4, a cadential 6-4, which is a type of dominant, which goes to 5, which is the dominant chord. And then Schubert does it all again, an octave lower. Neapolitan, whoops, then first inversion Neapolitan chord that goes to a cadential 6-4, to a 5, and to our final 1, right there. Crazy stuff, but cool stuff. So you can see how this piece is tricky because it makes us look at enharmonic writing some. You know, Chopin doesn't want to write in the key of F flat major any, so he goes to 4 sharps and writes like E flat major. He doesn't want to have to go to the trouble of writing A double or B double flat major chords that he's tonicizing, so he goes back into 4 sharps and tonicizes A major chords instead. But those A major chords sound like B double flat major chords because they lead to dominant chords in the key of A flat major. Wow, that's confusing to think about. But I swear that's what's happening here. So wrap your brains around it. As well, because the reason why I do this particular piece with advanced analysis class isn't just because of all that enharmonic stuff, but it's because of something bigger. It's because of the suspensions. The suspensions do something really cool to this piece. Basically, whenever you put a suspension on a chord, that's a way of extending that chord a little bit further. You know, you give that chord a little bit more life. Here's that French 6 chord from the beginning. It should go to 5 like that. It's fine. But when I put the suspension on, that sort of extends things a little bit more. I have to like resolve the suspension before I can be done. So suspensions make the piece get a little bit longer. And Schubert writes so many suspensions in this piece. And if you threw them out, you'd have a considerably shorter piece of music, which is kind of what this is all about. Do not perform this. But this is basically Schubert's Moment-Musicaux with a lot of the suspensions taken out. Most of the suspensions are dotted half notes. So really what I did was I just went through and I took out a lot of the dotted half notes. And when you do that, you get a much shorter piece. It still works, but it's not got all the elaboration and stuff. It's basically the equivalent of doing to a piece of music what something like spark notes or cliff notes do to a great novel, where you just want to like cut out all the great writing and stuff and just get down to the basics of, who murdered who in this book, because I have to write a book report by 1 o'clock tomorrow morning or something like that. So with this piece, you can do the same thing. You can go through and you can eliminate all those great suspensions. And when you do, the piece still works. I mean, the suspensions are beautiful. I love that suspension of that C, but really, all we're doing is we're going from 1 to 2. If that's all we're doing, that takes care of business just fine. Likewise, it's nice when we have that suspension of the F with the next gesture there. Whoops. But really, we could like leave out all that and just go straight to the 1 chord without the suspension. And suddenly that nice lyrical opening of Schubert's is reduced to just its very, very basic gestures. Whoops, darn it. Is it better than what Schubert wrote? Definitely not. But it's a way of looking at this piece. And I'm going to let the computer play a very stilted version of this reduced version of the piece as well, so you can follow along. Enjoy. But it sort of lets us see that, you know, the piece has a lot of elaboration. And when you look at it without elaboration, like if you look at those Roman numerals up there, you realize that those Roman numerals are telling a very basic story about how music goes. You know, a lot of times music starts out stable, gets a little tense, gets more tense, and then resolves that resolution. That's what happens when you go from a tonic to a predominant to a dominant functioning chord and back to a tonic. Or that's what happens when you go from a 1 chord to a 2-6-5 chord, that's a predominant, to a 7 half diminished 4-3 chord, that's a dominant functioning chord, and to a 1-6 chord, that's a tonic chord. That's a very, very basic musical service there. tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic. And all Schubert does is he like adds some nice suspensions to make that very, very prosaic trip more poetic. Filling in those details distracts me from the fact that all we're doing is and that's great. But this piece has a lot of suspensions in it. If you take out all the suspensions and all the long notes, then it becomes a much shorter piece, but a less interesting piece. And really you realize then that this piece is basically a musical version of this guy. Fishes, you know, and there are lots of animals that can do this. This is just the best picture I could find. You all perhaps know about puffer fishes. You know, whenever they get scared or frightened or whenever they want to look impressive, they can puff up and look really big. But if you actually meet them on the street, the underwater street, they look like this. They're rather skinny and modest. But whenever they want to look impressive, they puff up real big. Well, maybe Schubert has given us a musical puffer fish. And when it's puffed up, it looks like this and it sounds like this. But when you think about what's actually happening here, what are the bones of this piece? What's it really just trying to say? What does it look like when it's not puffed up? It looks like this. Interesting way of thinking about it, right? Because, you know, puffer fishes have their place in the natural order, and musical pieces that are puffer fishes do too. So I kind of like the way Schubert has written this piece, and through, among other things, the wonders of suspensions and retardations, has found a way to puff it up and make it this really, really lovely sounding, kind of pretty, harmonically fuzzy, indeterminate piece of music. Way to go, pufferfish. After all the grueling stuff we've thought about with suspensions and modulations and then harmonic writing and stuff, you know, suddenly an easy question is the big picture question, which is what's the form of this thing? And, you know, while the form of the allegretto can be tricky because you could say rounded binary or ternary and defend your case either way, when you look at the whole piece, it's a pretty easy form to talk about, because when we're looking at the whole piece, what we're talking about is we're talking about a composite ternary form. And of course, ternary forms are ABA forms, aren't they? So the way this piece works is that first section in A flat, the allegretto section, is our A. The trio, which is in D flat, is our B section. And then because of what Schubert says to do with the performance instructions, go back and do the allegretto again. That means we're repeating the A. So we're going A, B, A, just like ternary does. And remember, the thing about ternary form is what we like is we like the variety between the A and the B. So if you look at this and you try to figure out how does the B section sound different from the A section, well, you know, one thing that's really clear is the B section's in a totally different key. It's in D flat, not in A flat. And the other thing is the melodic material in section B is different. The motives are different. You know, the motive for section A, it's pretty much all quarter notes and dotted half notes and stuff. For section B, though, we've got some eighth notes in there, and the motive is more that dun 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 dun. And so it's, you know, it's recognizably different melodically. So it's an easy composite ternary form from that standpoint. And when you go to look at the parts of the allegretto, then you've got an A section that's the first 16 measures, and a B, and then an A that comes back. And you could call it either an A and say it's ternary, or you could call it an A prime and say it's rounded binary. You just have to be ready to make the case for how this is acting more like binary music and being developmental, and to then say, why is it okay that it didn't modulate in the A section? Or you have to be able to make the case that this is ternary music and being contrast oriented between the A and the B, in which case you'd have to be able to make the case about, so why does the B not sound that different? but both are defensible. Likewise with the trio, you can see it as having an A and a B and an A section as well. And it's probably a pretty straightforward ternary form because the A section didn't modulate and the A section came back complete at the end there. But the reason we say the whole piece, all of number 6 of the Moment Musicaux, is composite ternary, when we're saying it's composite, what we're saying is this. When we say it's ternary, we're saying it's an ABA form. And when we say it's composite, what we're saying is that you can look at either the A or the B part, or both of that ABA form, and at least one of them is going to be an independent form. So when we look at the A, the allegretto, or the B, the trio, and we realize that you can view the allegretto and the trio as being rounded binary or ternary forms unto themselves. That's what makes this a composite ternary form. It's a big form, ternary, built out of smaller forms. Schubert piece, that Lied der Doppelgänger. And of course, you should have already turned in the assignment on the Doppelganger when you turned in your assignment on the Moment Musicaux. So the next thing we need to do is go watch video number 8 together and talk about how Schubert's messing with our minds in the Doppelganger. So I'll see y'all on the next video.